Welcome back, beautiful tri-state area. You're listening to A Moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York, iHeartRadio. I'm your host, Zen Sams. Welcome back to the Brain Blueprint segment brought to you by the Melillo Centers, where evidence-based neuroscience helps children and adults rebalance their brains and reclaim their potential. Lately, my feed has been flooded with one headline after another. Tylenol causes autism, circumcision linked to neurological damage. RFK Jr. says the government is hiding the truth. According to the CDC, about 1 in 36 children in the U.S. are now diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And that's a number that understandably worries every parent. But when public figures start mixing anecdote with science, confusion spreads faster than truth. So today, we're stripping away the noise with one of the most trusted voices in developmental neuroscience, Dr. Robert Melillo. His work has been cited in over 100 scientific papers and featured worldwide for reframing how we understand autism, ADHD, and the developing brain. Welcome to the show, superstar.
Oh, thank you for having me. I can't wait to get into this topic.
I know, you can't wait. Neither can I, because like I said, those headliners are flooding and a ton of misinformation and fear is starting to spread. So let's begin with the elephant in every headline. RFK Jr. recently claimed that Tylenol use during pregnancy and even circumcision could raise autism risk. Now, those statements have parents in panic mode, understandably so, Dr. Melillo. So from your decades of research and clinical practice, what does the science actually say? Is there any truth to these connections, or are we seeing correlation being mistaken for causation again?
Very good point. So first, let me say off from the very beginning that overall what I think RFK is doing and the administration is doing is I support. I think that they're bringing out certain things and we're having conversations about this, right? So this is good. I mean, I wrote a book in 2013 about this very topic with the idea that I wanted to start some conversation around what is causing this rise in all different types of childhood neurological issues? And is there something that can be done to maybe prevent it or slow it down or whatever, as well as what can be done after the fact? And so in this book, one of the first things, and this is the problem I have right now, is just the messaging is terrible.
Yeah.
What they're saying isn't, wrong per se. But the way they're putting it out there is giving the wrong message. I mean, I had a parent that was from a foreign country, I think Brazil. We're working with their autistic child here in New York. And we went through a consultation. At the very end, he said to me, "Can I ask you a question? Your government just said last week that Tylenol causes autism." Now, that's not what the statement was at all, but that's what they got out of it. And that's what a lot of people got out of it.
Yeah.
And, there's so many things that you have to take into account. Obviously you can look at it from, and as you just said, the last statement is that there's correlations here. That doesn't mean causation.
Right.
Obviously, if Tylenol itself caused autism, everybody who ever took Tylenol would either have autism or their children would have autism. So there's some other factor that might be associated with it. And just because it's correlation doesn't mean causation.
Exactly. And that distinction really matters, because in the era of viral clips, people hear a 30-second soundbite and start making life-altering decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate how you clarify that any association in one study doesn't prove a cause, especially without peer-reviewed replication. Now, I want to move on to, is autism actually rising, right? So the CDC says rates have risen from 1 in 150 in the year 2000 to 1 in 36 today, 2025. So that's staggering. But does it reflect a true increase, or, in your opinion, is it just a broader diagnostic criteria and awareness that we've come into?
Yeah. So again, let me start off by saying that I spent, over 2 years researching this book here, The Autism, the Scientific Truth About Preventing, Diagnosing, and Treating Autism Spectrum Disorder, and what parents can do now. When I spoke to a number of epidemiologists, which are people that really study this stuff, right? And so looking at, we see the numbers rise. Are they a real increase, or are we just recognizing it more, which is really what the controversy is out there. And the answer is about 50% of the increase is because we're recognizing it better and we're diagnosing it better, and we have better tools and better awareness, and we've expanded the diagnostic criteria and all of that. But at least 50% of the increase is not explained by any of that. That means that they represent new cases that never existed before, which means that there is actually this dramatic rise. And the only way you can explain that is through looking at different environmental factors, because for the most part, autism and almost any other developmental disorder is not caused by a genetic mutation. There is no one mutation or autism gene or ADHD gene. There are genes that may impart traits and predispositions, but they're not mutations. There's no injury in the brain. There's no damage. So what is actually happening? And so all of this needs to be considered. And we know that, there's no such thing as a genetic epidemic. And most of the parents, if not all of the parents of children with autism, usually are not diagnosed with autism. Only about 18% of the siblings may be diagnosed with autism. So therefore, if it was genetic, you would think, well, one or both of the parents have it, but there are traits.
So genetics alone can't explain such a rapid shift, okay? Environmental factors often get politicized, right?
Correct.
So where does the truth lie between DNA and daily exposures?
Well, the fact is that, again, if we're seeing this increase, there need to be factors other than genetic mutations that are affecting and they're impacting brain development without causing damage or injury. So what we overall look at is these are lifestyle issues, meaning that there's something in our lifestyle as a whole, as society, that's changed in the past 30 years that has affected brain development in our children. I mean, those are factors, right? Now there's a lot of research out there saying, what could those factors be? And that's where correlations like, well, if a mom has Tylenol when she's pregnant, there's an increased risk of her having a child with autism, right? Okay, it doesn't mean that it caused it, but there's a correlation. Now, that could be for other reasons. Why did the mom take Tylenol? Because she had a fever. Well, we know that if you have a flu virus or if you have an increase of certain immune factors or inflammation or a stress response, that elevates your risk of having a child with autism. And most lifestyle factors do that in some way. And so there's a number of different things, but basically the same thing. We're seeing also, an epidemic rise of obesity and cancer and diabetes and hypertension and autoimmunity and adult mental health issues. So the same factors that are driving that, things like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, lifestyle factors, are also driving what we're seeing with autism and ADHD and other developmental issues. And, so they're not really specific to autism per se, at least as far as we know, but all we can do is look and say there are correlations that if this is happening, if you have this type of, lifestyle or behavior, or you're doing this, then there's certain calculations that say can elevate your risk a certain percentage. Like, for instance, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension in a mom or a dad will elevate the risk of having a child with autism about 150% each.
Wow.
But the good news is, of course, that if you know that before you're getting pregnant, and if you get your weight under control or lower your blood pressure naturally or, normalize your blood sugar, then you can eliminate that risk. And now it no longer becomes a risk, right? And so you've lowered that risk. And this is the thing that nobody's talking about. And that's what I wrote that book about.
And knowledge is power. And I love that you just highlighted epigenetics, because I think that's the answer, right? So, how environment can switch genes on or off. That's it. And it makes this story of hope, not doom, right? This is a story, because when you tie it back to what you said, to epigenetics and how environment really shifts those genes on or off, when you look at the overall of the story we're trying to tell, is that it takes this story and now it's a story of hope, not doom, because it means lifestyle and prevention matter. And that's at the heart of what you're saying. And I truly think that that's important, because people are missing that part.
It's hugely important, because people understand when you hear something's a genetic disorder or it's inheritable, it's inherited. They don't really understand what that means. Most people mean, well, there's a genetic mutation and the gene is broken and there's nothing I can do about it, or there's one gene that's causing this. epigenetics changed that whole science
Yeah.
permanently, because it means that without actually damaging or mutating a gene could be silenced or turned off or turned on when it's not supposed to be.
That's brilliant.
And different environmental factors have an influence on that and can change that. Now, there's a number of things about the human brain that make it uniquely vulnerable. And this is obviously my area of study, is studying human brain development. The human brain is unique in that, one, it's the largest brain per body size of any primate. Two, because we're the only bipedal or that walk upright, we have the smallest birth canal. So most of the development of our brain has to be restricted in the womb, and most of it develops outside. 80% of it develops outside the womb and is designed to adapt to the environment. So the genes that regulate brain development, 84% of our genes are active during human brain development. So just if any of those genes are going to be affected by environmental factors, the ones that regulate the brain are most likely, because there's so many. But then also they're the most sensitive because they're designed to be sensitive, and they are the ones that can be impacted, especially the ones that form functional connections between the brain and between the hemispheres. So when we talk about epigenetics, any factor that might alter or affect expression of the genes is going to usually impact brain development and may slow or impact brain development so that it can alter the way the brain is supposed to grow and develop. And that's what we see. And our research has shown that's what's happening in autism and ADHD. The brain is kept in a more immature state, and then we see imbalances that develop, especially between the hemispheres, and that's what these issues are.
Right. So that you just said it. I mean, you've said that you can't talk about causation without first understanding the neurology itself. So, I mean, this is explaining a lot for our listeners and for the viewers tuning in. I mean, what you're describing is essentially what's going on in the brain. So for someone listening, tuning in right now, if you could simplify it in English language, what's going on inside the brain of someone with autism or ADHD?
So, and as you said, this is the thing that's not being talked about at all. And this is the thing, I don't think RFK has people around him that understand this, that what is actually happening in the brain in these issues. And if you don't understand that, then you can't talk about causation, you can't talk about really prevention, and you can't talk about even what treatment may work or not work. So what our research has shown, and I think we've done as much research as anybody in this, is that there is this overall delay in development of the brain where the brain isn't progressing or growing at the rate it should. And then this leads to developmental imbalances where certain areas and certain networks in one side of the brain might be developing faster or even maybe faster than normal, while other areas of the brain may be delayed and immature. And these imbalances in growth is affecting the communication and the synchronization of brain networks and the communication. It's a breakdown of communication in the brain where certain areas, each side of the brain works to keep each other in balance. And there's this dynamic balance in the brain. And again, the brain is created to be that way. And the right and left brain are very different in humans. And that's our greatest advantage. All brains have a right and left side from the beginning of time. But the way that happens is the right brain takes the lead in development in the first 3 years and keeps the left brain in check. And then the left brain comes up at the end of those 3 years and for the next 3 years, and it keeps the right brain. But then at the end of 6 years, the foundation of the differences in the right and left brain are there, but they need to be balanced and integrated. And then as the brain matures, the right and left brain become more and more and more specialized, but they need to become more and more synchronized. If anything disrupts that growth, that balance, that sequence, if one side gains too much of an advantage, it now will break down communication. That delicate balance doesn't exist. And now we get overactivity in areas of the brain and networks, like in autism, areas on the left side that produce things called stims or tics or repetitive movement or OCD, or increased inflammation or immune responses or anger outbursts or, other things like that, but also gifts like being able to read before the age of 2 or having a photographic memory or perfect pitch. On the other hand, the right brain is, if that's not developing, we will delay the onset of normal social development, nonverbal communication, being able to feel and connect with our own body and regulate our own emotions and develop attachment to other people and be able to see the big picture and have more kind of wisdom and understanding. And so, they all work together. And if this balance is disrupted, we get, and the, overactive areas, underactive, and depending on whether that's the right or the left or what areas is really what comes together to form not only childhood issues, but really 90% of adult mental health issues start in childhood and are part of the same problem.
Yeah, what you just explained, that was everything. Because that visual of the brain's two hemispheres being quote unquote out of sync is so powerful that it turns a label into a mechanism people can understand and actually fix through targeted stimulation and rehabilitation, which is everything you advocate for. And that's the entire narrative of the Melillo Center. So I love that. Which brings me to the book that started the shift. We alluded to something a little bit earlier, but you are in this for the long haul and have been one of the pioneers when it comes to authoring books on autism. Your 2013 book, Autism, The Scientific Truth, was ahead of its time. And you were quoted throughout a full page in the New York Post article that same year. So what made you step into that conversation before it was mainstream?
Really two things. One is because I have always worked for over 30 years with families with kids with delays and autism and ADHD and dyslexia and learning disabilities and adults. Many of the parents would come to me and say, listen, we want to have another child, but we're afraid. We're afraid we're going to have another child with autism and it might be overwhelming. And listen, that doesn't mean to sound judgmental or negative, but if you haven't walked in the shoes of a parent with a non-speaking kid, it's really hard and it's really difficult. And so, they were coming to me with these questions. And then I also had a nephew who, was a very bright guy and he had a lot of friends, Ivy League friends, and they were, out on a weekend out eastern Long Island. And he came back and he said to me, a lot of my friends who just got married or are thinking about getting married said they don't want to have kids because they're afraid of having a kid with disability because there's so many of them around now. And I thought, wow, there needs to be a conversation on this so that the reality, because people are reacting, they don't know, and they need to have some real information. So I started working with families and just trying to use some common sense things like, okay, let's look at blood work and let's look at things like, do you have vitamin deficiencies? Do you have inflammatory markers? Do you have heavy metals or toxins in your body? Can we work to lower those things? Can we look at your blood pressure, your weight? Can we look at other factors? And can we look at your brain? Do you have balanced brains, right? Because if your brains are not balanced, to me, that's the number one risk that you may have.
Right.
And doing things like that. Even things like age. Like we know that over the age of 35 for a woman, over the age of 40, there's an increased risk of having a child with a disability like autism. And again, preconception is where most of these risks are. So they're there before you get pregnant, and they're equal in men and women. So they don't just involve women or men. So again, there never should be any blame or anything like that felt by anybody. But the idea is that, even age, you can actually kind of lower your functional age. There's your chronological, and then there's your real age. And you can actually lower. You could be a 35-year-old woman with a 25-year-old body, or you could be a 35-year-old woman with a 45-year-old body.
Yeah.
And you can even measure that by looking at your genes and something called telomeres. And so there are many factors that you can do, and that's how we started doing that. And I've worked with several hundred families, and none of them had a second child that was diagnosed with autism. Now, did we prevent it? We can't prove that, but did we lower the risk? Yes, we did that in measurable ways, and it may have helped.
There you go. Now, you've long said that toxic exposure and stress and nutrition and sleep all play roles. So the factors today that stand out the most in your research, which factors are they, and do they impact men and women differently?
I think number one, like I said, is a brain imbalance. Ian McGilchrist, who's somebody I really respect, he's a psychiatrist from the UK, has written a number of books on how we're moving more and more towards a left brain society, meaning the way we educate kids, our jobs, everything we're doing, sitting in front of technology, playing video games, all of that feeds the left brain and is creating an overactivity, and we're really kind of favoring that. So that's one thing. But movement is really the number one thing. I think when we look at the impact of computer and computer games and technology, they do favor the left brain, but also we don't move, right? We sit in front of our computers all day. And, I remember when I first started researching my first book, I spoke to a teacher and she said, I don't know how this works, but I think what's causing this is kids don't use their big muscles anymore. She said, you used to go around and see kids in the street riding their bikes, climbing trees, playing football in the street. You don't see that anymore. She said, I see kids on the playground. And this was 25 years ago. Right. She said they used to play. They don't do that anymore. They sit there and they're starting to get these things called Game Boys and stuff like that. Now they all have phones and they're not moving. And movement is the number one thing for developing the brain, especially big muscle movement promotes right brain development. But also when you're moving and playing games, you're socializing, you're learning how to read other people's bodies, and you're getting connected to your own body. And that also lowers your stress response. And so that's a big thing. And then stress, or we're under so much more stress. And, I think technology and all these things has only contributed to that. And that just fuels inflammation. All those three factors, I think, are the number one factors that we see happening.
Well, thanks for clarifying those. You definitely want to get those into check for all you men and women listening out there, which brings me to these new treatments. So there's a buzz around leucovorin. Am I saying it right?
Mm-hmm.
And to my understanding, it's being tested as a treatment for autism. So what's your take on those studies, and where should parents draw the line between innovation and internet hype?
Well, this is the thing. This is being driven by people that don't understand the brain and brain development and what autism is in the brain. Most of the people out there, and again, I have good friends in this community and I teach neuroimmunology in the functional medicine world, they understand the body, they understand the gut, they understand the immune system to a certain extent. They don't understand how the brain actually takes the lead and regulates all of that, and why we have a gut problem or a leaky gut, or why we have inflammation, why we have imbalances in our immune system, and what fuels that. And it all really starts in the brain and the brainstem. And so what happens is that, like when you look at something like anything, like vaccines or like Tylenol or whatever, and you say, okay, if vaccines themselves were the primary cause of autism, then everybody who was ever vaccinated, every child should have autism. And even the most staunch vaccine people say, yeah, okay, well, there's something different about these kids. Now, because they didn't look into the brain or nervous system, they look and say, well, they don't detoxify. Okay, why wouldn't they detoxify? Well, they need folic acid and B12 and other vitamins, and they have deficiencies, and kids with autism have been tested, and they show that they have less of that. And then we look and we find that they may have a version of a gene called the MTHFR gene, or they may have antibodies that go against their folate receptors. And that must be the reason. It's not the primary reason, but that is the line of thinking. The problem doesn't start in the gut. It doesn't start with that. But this is where leucovorin now is a more powerful form of folate. Now, I have many kids, and they've been tested for the MTHFR, and they're all on folic acid of some sort or B12, and it may be helpful, and they may have deficiencies, but it's being caused because they have an imbalance in what we call their sympathetic and parasympathetic, and their gut isn't working. They're not producing acid, and that's because of their brain and their brain stem. So leucovorin, it may help a bit. It's not the magic bullet that people may think it is. Is no harm in using it for the most part, although some kids can be over methylated. Right. But the bottom line is, I think it comes down to not understanding the brain, not understanding what actually is happening in the brain of someone with autism, and looking at other things going on and thinking that's the cause when it's really the result.
Yeah. I mean, that's the key takeaway. No quick fixes, just layered understanding of metabolism and neural repair. Science moves forward when we ask better questions, not when we look for miracles. I always say that. Now, we are at the end. I have one more question here for you, or two more, but I'm going to keep it cognizant of the time. So the Melillo Method and real world results. I mean, you've developed the Melillo Method and now run 2 Melillo centers right here in New York City, helping patients of all ages rebalance their brain. Can you share what your results look like and how quickly families see changes?
Well, that's the thing. Well, we've been doing this for a long time. And we work with especially non-speaking autism, which is the most challenging, but also the most rewarding. And what we're able to do often is give them their voice without losing their genius, because all these kids are geniuses.
Yeah.
And literally, I'm not exaggerating that or saying that, to make people feel good. It's a real fact. So, these are the kind of results we get, but we do a very comprehensive, looking at the gut and looking at food sensitivities and looking at folate metabolism, and all those things are very important. All of those things absolutely can help change symptoms and can improve kids' function and adults, but it's not the root cause. And what we're dealing with is the root cause. Like, one of the biggest mysteries that I've spent my 30 years trying to understand is, why doesn't a kid with autism speak? Nobody's ever answered that question before.
Right.
And so thanks to the help of many of these kids who have given me some of these answers, along with our research and my research partners, we've been able to answer that, I think, better than anybody else. And you can't really even think that you're going to give a kid his voice back if you don't know why he can't speak to begin with.
Yeah, that's so inspiring. Hearing parents say their child is finally making eye contact or even sleeping through the night. I mean, those are the wins that statistics can't capture, that no one really talks about, but that progress is a huge milestone for these families. Now we have 1 minute left, and the latest research and future of autism and science is at the forefront of everybody's brain. So your lab has published over 100 papers and just released, in fact, a new study in the MDPI Journal of Brain Sciences titled Autism Spectrum Disorder: What Do We Know and Where Do We Go? So what did you discover about where the field is headed next?
Well, that's the thing. We've been doing a lot of research, and over the past 3 or 4 years, we've published about 10 major papers in top journals like the British Medical Journal on looking at what is actually happening in the brain. One of the things we found was that, there's a thing called retained primitive reflexes. As I said, movement is the most important thing to develop the brain. And the foundation of movement in humans is these things called primitive reflexes. And what we've been able to show is that in different types of delays like autism, many of them don't come on and they don't go away. They're supposed to come on for the first year and lead development of the brain and then go away. And if they don't go away, now they hold back the brain and they keep it in an immature state and they lead to these imbalances. And we've been able to do studies that, in fact, show that and show that we can get rid of those reflexes and then we can balance the brain out. And in doing that, we can change. And we've shown imaging of before and after on the brain where we can change the way the brain is working and coordinating and synchronizing. We also can change gut function and all of the balance between that systems. And I think that, that's where more of our research is going on. And that's what we wanted to write. So that paper, which is pretty timely, came out, saying, hey, what do we know about autism now? Again, what is happening in the brain and what do we do moving forward? And that's really where the conversation should be. And that's why we wrote that paper.
Beautiful. This is so exciting. And we are officially at the end of time today. We're at the end of our time here, because when I look at the conversations, I want to specifically react to what you just said. What you said moves the conversation from blame to biology and from fear to function. So this paper is so timely, and we're finally taking solutions. We're finally talking about solutions instead of speculation. And I think you putting this into perspective and releasing that publication is extremely important for the community. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing. And more importantly, Dr. Melillo, thank you for cutting through the chaos and reminding us that science, not sound bites, should guide our decisions.
It's my pleasure. And again, I think, for more information, really, without sounding promotional, I mean, my book, I think is the best source. And I think it's also, we're always trying to give a hopeful message, right? Because the idea is it's never too early, it's never too late to do something, whether you're doing it preconception, but even after the fact. If people want help, there is help out there, and things can be helped, not to change these people, but to give them the best version of themselves, which is what we all want and what every parent wants for their child.
There you go. And for those listening, you can head directly on the gram at Dr. Robert Melillo across all platforms, and you can head directly to his website at drrobertmelillo.com. This has been the Brain Blueprint, brought to you by the Melillo Centers, where innovation meets healing and every brain has the power to reconnect. You're listening to A Moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York, iHeartRadio. I'm your host, Zen Sams. We'll be right back after this.